This is another reason why we have a building fund. We're doing a fundraiser because we're running out of room. All right, so last week we made our way through Isaiah 2, verses 20 through 22, and also Isaiah 3, verses 1 through 5. Now we know that at this point, we are in the vision that Isaiah is having that God has given him. And what's going on in this vision? Well, the Israelites have once again rebelled against God. This continues time and time and time again. And it's happening again here. Now, last week, as we worked our way through those verses, we learned that the idols that the Israelites had created from silver and gold, they weren't going to be able to rescue them from the wrath of God that was coming. Here they had invested all this time worshiping something that they had created with their own hands. They created it. They know how these idols were developed. And yet, because of their sheer arrogance, they believed they created something better to worship than the very one who created all things. The very one who rescued them. The very one who provided for them. The very one who gave them the very materials to make these false little gods. We see the sheer arrogance of man. Here God has given them everything. And what do they do with it? They create something that they want to worship. Have we not learned from the golden calf? No. And yet, their own creation wasn't going to save them. Instead, they would run like cowards, flee to the places where the moles and the bats dwell, as if God's wrath can't find them in the dark places. Now, we also learned last week that during the process of his wrath, he's going to take away their food, their water, their leaders, their warriors, their judges, the prophets, the elders, and their counselors. Everything that he has given to them, he is taking away. And why? For the Israelites no longer recognized him as the provider. So he was going to prove to them that everything they had was from him. From food to protection to leadership, gone. And what happens during that time? We are told that neighbor will turn against neighbor, the young against the elderly. Oppression will fall upon them. For a place like Judah and Jerusalem, at one time where they worship the Holy of Holies, will become a place which is wicked and unruly without God. And yet that's what the Israelites wanted, a place without God. They wanted to worship what they saw fit to worship. What they didn't understand, but soon would, was that God is and will always be the only one that deserves worshiping. We're going to be looking at Isaiah 3, verses 6 through 15. Looking at verse 6, it says, "For a man will take hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, 'You have a cloak, you shall be our leader, and this heap of ruins shall be under your rule.'" Church, there was a time in the land of Judah and Jerusalem when there was plenty of food, water, protection, leadership, and elders. All of that had been given to the Israelites. The land itself, the promised land, had been given to them by God. But no longer. to be honest with you, I believe that Judah was already under the wrath of God by this time. And we'll see why I say that when we get to verse 8. But for Jerusalem, that time was coming. That time would strike when the Chaldeans would slaughter the land. And what would happen? The Chaldeans would leave Judah and Jerusalem as a former shell of itself. They will be poverty-stricken. The leader would not be called to rule because of his intelligence, his bravery, or how godly of a man he is. No, now just the possession of a coat is the qualification for a man to lead this once bountiful land. What does this mean, church? It means that the godly leaders are no longer around, so someone must lead. That is the punishment that God is given his people. It's sad, isn't it? That the man with the cloak is the wealthiest man in the land. You see how far they have fallen? But that's the qualification now for them. A coat. And yet even some would deny owning a coat because no one wants to rule when people no longer respect the leaders, the elders, the counselors, and so on and so on and so on. And no one wants to rule a land that has been shredded. It is absolutely terrifying how this parallels with us today. I mean, we're just weeks away from a vote, and I know what you're thinking, Britt, you've been awfully political here lately. Well, that's because that's the season that we're in. I mean, there's only one option for believers. I said this Sunday, and we're going to continue to say it. When it comes to voting, there's only one party to vote for. For the Democratic Party is anti-God. How can you, as a believer, vote for that party which hates him? The very one who's provided everything. How can we vote for a party that is okay with killing babies? How can we vote for the party that says little 8-year-old Johnny, because he wants to be a girl, can now be one? How can we vote for a party that says it's okay to go out in the streets and protest a Marxist movement, but how dare you meet in church? But this is where we are today. Could it be that God's wrath is falling on this nation? Could be. Do you think you could talk to a true believer and ask them, if Biden is elected, do you believe that's God's wrath? For a true believer would have to say, it appears that way. But our comfort comes in knowing that God is sovereign, that he will be glorified. We may be persecuted, but even that we are told throughout the New Testament to be thankful. Verse 7 says, in that day he will speak out, saying, I will not be a healer. In my house there is neither bread nor cloak. You shall not make me leader of the people. Nobody wants this position. No one is qualified for this position. And some of the people that are going to be asked, they are so poverty-stricken, they can't feed their family, nor can they clothe them. So how can they lead? This is the judgment of God upon those who do not want a godly leader. And this is what God is doing. By providing no leadership, those who are qualified don't want it or are gone. And his judgment comes when those who take it aren't qualified. Again, God is going to give the Israelites exactly what they want, a godless land led by incompetent, godless leaders. Verse 8 says, "For Jerusalem has stumbled." Now this is why I believe that Judah is already under the wrath during the vision of Isaiah. For Jerusalem has stumbled, so that is coming. Judgment is coming for them, but Judah has fallen. Because their speech and their deeds are against the Lord, defying his glorious presence. God's people have forgotten the covenant. See, if the people would have continued within the laws that God had given them, he would have continued to bless them. But the Israelites only wanted a God who they could serve just one day a week for a couple of hours. And then the rest of the time they could do whatever they wanted. They didn't want the almighty, powerful God to be involved in every aspect of their lives. They wanted to compartmentalize God. Does that not sound like the Western church today? I'm cool with God on Sundays and maybe Wednesday evenings, but the other days are mine. I can do whatever I want. Those decisions that I make on those other days, that's up to me. They only wanted God when they needed him. They only wanted certain attributes of God. If they don't like a certain attribute, maybe wrath or judgment, we'll just take that out and put it aside. We'll take the attributes that we like and create our own God. That's who we're going to serve. And as a matter of fact, not only will we do that, but we'll take the gold and silver and even create him. And that's how they treated God. But what happens to a society that treats God that way? What happens to their sinful nature? It becomes exposed. And by exposed, I mean out in the open. No longer are they trying to hide it from God behind closed doors or in the dark of night. No! Wide open. They defied his glorious presence right before his very eyes. Look at verse 9. For the look on their faces bears witness against them. They proclaimed their sin like Sodom. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Out in the open. And we see the example given in this vision where Isaiah says they proclaimed their sin like Sodom. Now we know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The wickedness that was taking place, they weren't hiding from God. Out in broad daylight, their sins were there. And it seems as if this is exactly what's taking place in Judah and Jerusalem. They waved their sins proudly, the way in which the rainbow flag is waved at a gay pride parade today. And this is concerning. I do not recommend looking it up, but one of the most perverse events you can watch is a gay pride parade. They're not hiding that sin. It's right there, out in the open, where you can see men and women mocking God and his creation. And this lifestyle is being accepted by this so-called church. Now, this is an article from Time magazine. 3 other Christian denominations that allow gay marriage. Now, this is from 2015, so we're a lot further along now. Or shall I say, the decline is a lot further along. On Tuesday, the Presbyterian Church USA voted to redefine marriage as a commitment between 2 people, traditionally a man and a woman, formally allowing same-sex marriages within the church. The vote to modify the church constitution follows last year's recommendation from the church's General Assembly. Here's our other major churches in the U.S. that allow same-sex marriage. The Evangelical Lutheran Church of America allows same-sex couples to get married, but leaves it up to individual ministers of congregations to decide according to 2009 resolution. There is nothing that prescribes who a congregation pastor can marry or not marry so long as it is consistent with the state law. The ELCA secretary, David Swartling, said in 2012, the Episcopal Church established a rite of blessing for same-sex couples in 2012 and prohibited discrimination against transgender people. It has welcomed gay people since 1976, when its General Convention decided that homosexual persons are children of God who have a full and equal claim with all other persons upon the love, acceptance, and pastoral concern and care of the church. Technically, it has no official policy sanctioning same-sex marriage, but it will take this issue up in June. The United Church of Christ has allowed same-sex couples to get married since 2005. At the 25th General Synod of the United Church of Christ in Atlanta, it affirmed equal marriage rights for couples regardless of gender and declares that the government should not interfere with couples regardless of gender who choose to marry and share fully and equally in the rights, responsibilities, and commitment of legally recognized marriage. It was the first major Protestant denomination to do so. Greg Johnson, pastor of Memorial PCA, said this, and this was from June 28th, 2019. Last night, NS won the battle. That's the Nashville statement that we at Christ Reformed Church signed, speaking against homosexual marriage within the church. Last night, Nashville's statement won the battle, but they will lose the war. We had a seat at the table. That's new. Notice the average age of the proponents and opponents, big shift. About 40% of PCA leaders rejected the Nashville statement. We got a study committee whose report will supersede Nashville's statement in PCA. For clarity, the Nashville statement stands for the tepid Nashville statement, which abandoned male headship in exchange for trying to hold the line on homosexual intercourse and marriage. To Pastor Johnson, the Nashville statement's victory, being commended by the assembly, will be short-lived. Church, the PCA is the Presbyterian Church of America, one of the last conservative churches. And here they are with one of their pastors speaking against the Nashville statement. The Southern Baptist, they're not doing any better. J.D. Greer, the head of the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, I should say the president, is making statements that aren't as bold as what we just read from Pastor Johnson, but they are heading in that same direction. Church, I say this not to beat up on the homosexual community. I say this because they need to hear the truth. They need to hear that the lifestyle that they are living is sinful and it goes against God. But if you have churches no longer standing with what the Word says, how are they going to hear the truth? Really, the two last conservative denominations, the PCA and the SBC, are following the liberal denominations. Continuing, Isaiah says, they do not hide it. Woe to them, for they have brought evil on themselves. This is what happens. No longer is sin wrong. What was once evil is now considered good. And this is what happens when leaders, pastors, elders, counselors are more concerned about pleasing man than they are God. Verse 10, tell the righteous that it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their deeds. Again, church, this was the covenant that God made with his people. But I believe this verse is still speaking to the leaders. Those who do right by God will experience the blessings of God. Now, many will say, well, what about Job? Was he not a righteous man? Yes, but remember, we must keep everything in its proper context. The story of Job wasn't dealing with just a man who was pleasing to the Lord, but there was an added layer to that story. God allowing Satan to go after Job. But in the end, what happened? Job was blessed by God for doing that which was right. The issue within Isaiah is that as a whole, Judah and Jerusalem, their leaders flat out rebelled against God. And the people, the majority of them, followed in the leaders' footsteps. So for a while they were prospering, but when they turned from worshiping God and began to worship that which their hands made, then what? Verse 11, woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with them, for what his hands have dealt out shall be done to him. What is this saying, church? That one will reap what they have sown. Judah was experiencing it, and Jerusalem will be. We're about to move into the verses where the Lord is going to indict the leadership. Look at verse 12. It says, my people, infants are their oppressors, and women rule over them. At one point, God's people were led by competent men that he put there. But no longer. Their leaders are now childlike, immature in their decision making. They do not seek the wisdom of God, but their own folly. They will not lead as godly, but as selfish opportunists. The women aspect seems to be of sarcasm, the same way that infants is being used. So it could be describing the leaders that God is using to punish Judah and Jerusalem were being weak like women. Now, before anyone blows a gasket, let's remember that the Bible isn't politically correct. It's not going to be, and we're not going to make it that way. Physically, if you were to take a man and a woman of the same size, 99.999 999% of the time, who is going to win that battle? The man. Unless you're fighting Cyborg or Ronda Rousey or something along those lines. But those are professional athletes. Your average man going against your average woman is going to be stronger and more powerful. That was an old UFC reference. Ronda Rousey was so long ago. I apologize for that. I hate it when you're trying to be cool and then you say something that's like, that's so 8 years ago. But this is what is taking place. The leaders are immature and weak. It continues and says, "O my people, your guides mislead you, and they have swallowed up the course of your paths." Now I believe here that right here, because this is already taking place, this is speaking to the land of Judah. That these godless leaders are already in play. And yet the people aren't innocent, for they followed along in the wickedness of their leaders. And it's in these last few verses, God exposes the sins of these horrendous leaders. Look at verse 13. "The Lord has taken his place to contend. He stands to judge peoples." When it comes to ruling over the people of God, in this theocracy that was given to the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, when they ruled, it wasn't a privilege. They couldn't just make their own laws. They had to uphold the laws of God and His alone. To be honest with you, that's why, in a way, I wish we were still under a theocracy. But that probably wouldn't be a good thing, so I take it back, because look at what man has done to the church. During the time of the theocracy, when the kings went against the laws of God, God's wrath falls. Verse 14 says, "The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders and princes of his people." The very ones who God put in charge would lead to the land's destruction. They would drive it into the ground. And yet these very leaders are responsible for their actions. Which again, church, brings us to this conundrum. Wait a minute, if God ordained for this to take place, how are the people responsible? Yes, God ordained for those men to be put in charge to drive the land to destruction. And yet, at the same time, these very leaders followed their own actions. Notice nowhere in Scripture do we talk about an angel holding a gun to the head of the king saying, because God has ordained this, this is the way it's going to go. No. It's not there. So how do we reconcile this conundrum? We don't. So often we want to pit the ordination, predestination of God against the action of man. They're not enemies, they are friends. They were ordained to do it, yes. And did the leaders want to do it? Yes. So it's here that God lays out the charges for those who were ordained, yet wanted to. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The land being in turmoil was the fault of the leaders. And whose land is it? It's God's land that he laid aside for his own, and they destroyed it. In church, who is it that is usually hurt the most and first by the destruction of our leaders? The poor, the laborers, those who work with their hands, who work in the fields. But how can they when the idiots have destroyed it? These leaders have taken advantage of the poor. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. This is the one area in which God speaks of time and time again. We look out for the widows and the poor. But what are these leaders doing? They're taking from them. Now listen to me. When I talk about the poor, I'm not talking about those living off the government. We're speaking of those who go out and work hard day in and day out. We are to help those who help themselves. And these leaders are taking advantage of them. Even verse 15, it says, "What do you mean by crushing my people? By grinding the face of the poor, declares the Lord God of hosts." This is the judgment of God upon Judah and Jerusalem. And it should be terrifying to read this. Terrifying because, again, this parallels with what we're going through right now. Now, we know the ending. We know how this plays out. God is going to be glorified in every single action that takes place. And for those whose faith is placed in the only begotten Son, we're going to stand righteous before God. However, church, that doesn't mean our life here on earth is going to be full of unicorns and rainbows. We very well could be facing persecution the same way as Judah and Jerusalem did. And I'll say this again. If that is the case, be grateful. Is it going to be difficult? Yes. Which is why I say that we as a church family need to learn how to bond together. Because we do not know what these next few months or even next, well, we don't know how many years. We don't know what that holds. God can do whatever he wants to do. So this very well could be setting up for a great revival, which would be wonderful. Or this very well could be God's judgment coming down upon us who do not want him. A country that despises him. However, we know the good news, and that's what we should be focusing on, and that's what we should be telling everyone we come across. All right. Questions? Comments?